I remember standing on the second floor balcony I designed, breathing in the sweet scent of the jasmine I'd planted in the garden below. Every salvaged beam and custom-drawn blueprint wasn't just about architecture. It was proof that I could rebuild something beautiful from near total ruin. A silent promise I thought my family and I shared. I believed I had built a foundation that could withstand any storm. I just never imagined the hurricane that would finally tear it all down wasn't coming from the coast, but from across my own dining room table. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Alice, and for the last 5 years, my entire world was built within the walls of an old resurrected house in Charleston, South Carolina. I remember standing on the second floor balcony I designed myself, breathing in the sweet, heavy scent of the jasmine I'd planted in the garden below. That scent, for me, was the smell of accomplishment, of promises kept. It was a fragrance I associated with sanctuary, a feeling I mistakenly believed was permanent, a foundation I thought could withstand any storm. I just never imagined the hurricane that would finally tear it all down wasn't coming from the coast, but from across my own dining room table. This house wasn't just a family heirloom, it was my masterpiece. My professional manifesto written in timber and stone 5 years ago, after a hurricane nearly tore it from its foundation. I remember the day the insurance adjuster left, shaking his head and muttering about condemnation. My mother, Catherine, stood amidst the debris in the ravaged living room, rain dripping through a gaping hole in the roof, and declared it a lost cause. "We'll sell the land," she'd said, her voice devoid of emotion. "It's the only sensible thing to do." They saw only ruin, a painful memory to be disposed of, but I saw the house's strong bones, the history etched into its heart pine floors, and the ghost of the home it could be again. I refused to let it die. Using every dollar of the inheritance my grandmother left me, a fund she had specified was for my future and my independence. I poured 2 years of my life and all of my skills as an architect into its revival. This was no simple renovation, it was a resurrection. I wasn't just writing checks from a comfortable distance. I was on site every single day. My boots caked in mud and my hair filled with sawdust. I argued with contractors, sourced period-accurate materials myself, and spent countless nights hunched over blueprints, ensuring every detail was perfect. I even learned how to properly plaster a wall because the first crew's work wasn't up to my standards. Mr. Hayes, my grandfather's old partner, would visit the site, a thermos of coffee in hand, and watch me work. "Your grandfather would be proud, Alice," he'd say. "But be careful. Mixing family and finances is like mixing cement with sand. The foundation looks solid until the first real storm hits." I had smiled and assured him it would be fine. We were family, after all. It started subtly, as these things often do. The atmosphere in the house began to change. A gradual cooling I tried to ignore, my mother, Catherine, had been making longer. Quieter phone calls to my sister, Lauren, who lived in California. When I'd walk into the room, the conversation would abruptly end with a whispered, "I'll call you back." Lauren's life had always seemed to glitter from a distance. A high-powered marketing job, a trendy apartment, a life unburdened by aging parents or a decaying ancestral home. Our semi-regular calls had become monologues of her misfortunes, a litany of complaints about her job, her ex-husband, her expenses, a narrative of perpetual crisis that always ended with a sigh and a hint for help. I'd offered advice, but what she really wanted was a bailout, something I was no longer in a position to provide after investing everything into our family home. I was proud of what I'd done. The house was now a local landmark, featured in architectural magazines. My parents lived here with me, enjoying the fruits of my labor in what was, for all intents and purposes, a luxury home. I paid the oversized property taxes. I managed the expensive upkeep, and I never once asked for a thing. When the ancient boiler finally gave out one winter, I replaced the entire HVAC system without complaint. I believed we were a unit, a team that had weathered a great storm together and come out stronger. I mistook their comfortable silence for gratitude. Then came the dinner. It was a Tuesday, and the air was thick with unspoken things, heavy and suffocating. My mother had prepared a roast chicken, a meal usually reserved for celebrations. The irony was suffocating. My father, Paul, was unusually silent, focusing on his meal with a meticulous intensity that set my teeth on edge. He was a master of passive agreement, of letting my mother wield the sword while he simply held the stone to sharpen it on. My mother, on the other hand, was all brittle energy and sharp smiles. She waited until I had taken a bite of chicken before she began her carefully rehearsed speech. "Alice," she began, her voice smooth and level. "Your father and I have made a decision. Lauren is coming home." I swallowed, the food suddenly tasteless in my mouth. "Home for a visit, that's great. She hasn't been back in years." "Not for a visit," my mother cut in, placing her fork down with a deliberate click. "She's moving back. Her divorce was finalized, and things have been difficult for her. She and the children need a fresh start, a stable foundation." The way she said stable foundation, her eyes sweeping across the dining room, the very walls I had raised. The chandelier I had painstakingly restored sent a cold dread coiling in my stomach. I tried to catch my father's eye, but he wouldn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on his plate as if it held the secrets to the universe. My mother slid a crisp, white envelope across the polished surface of the mahogany table, a table I had spent a month restoring by hand. "This is for you," she said. My hands felt disconnected from my body as I picked it up. It wasn't a letter, it was a typed, formal notice, cold and impersonal. It stated that I had 48 hours to vacate the premises with my personal belongings. I read the words over and over, but they refused to make sense. My own name looked alien on the page. "I don't understand," I whispered, looking from my mother's unyielding face to my father's averted gaze. "This is my home. I rebuilt this home. I paid for everything." "You did a wonderful job, dear," Catherine said, her tone laced with a condescending sweetness that was more insulting than any shout. "We are very grateful, but you're strong. Alice, you've always been independent. Lauren is fragile. She needs this. She has a family to think of. We've already had the deed transferred into her name. This house is hers." She then pushed a pen towards me, as if expecting me to endorse my own erasure. The air left my lungs, the sounds of the room, the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. The distant traffic faded into a dull roar in my ears. They hadn't just asked me to leave. They had orchestrated this coup behind my back, using my work, my money, and my love as the stage for my sister's grand return. I was just a caretaker, a temporary placeholder until the true heir arrived. The one who had given nothing was being handed everything, while I was being discarded. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. A strange, chilling calm washed over me. I simply stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound echoing in the tense silence. I looked at my parents, truly looked at them, and for the first time, I saw them not as my mother and father, but as strangers who had made a calculated business decision. And I knew, in that moment of terrible clarity, that I would have to make one of my own. I turned and walked out of the dining room without another word. I went straight to my office, the heart of the house where all my plans and designs had come to life. My initial shock was already hardening into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. I didn't pack clothes or books. My gaze fell upon the large fireproof safe tucked away in the closet, a feature I'd insisted on during the rebuild. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. A memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharp and clear. 5 years ago, before the first hammer swung, my father had sat me down in a cramped rental apartment with a thick stack of papers. "It's just some paperwork for the bank and insurance." "Alice," he'd said dismissively, tapping the pile, "a formality. It's to register your investment in the property. To protect you, I was young, eager, and so full of blind trust that I would have signed anything he put in front of me. I remembered scanning the dense legal text, my eyes glazing over. I'd signed where he pointed, filed it away, and forgotten all about it. Until now. With cold, steady hands, I spun the dial on the safe and pulled the heavy door open. There it was, a heavy sheaf of documents bound in a blue folder. I laid it on my desk, my architect's lamp illuminating the title on the front page. My breath hitched. It wasn't an investment agreement. It was a deed of trust. I knew enough about property law to understand the profound difference. This wasn't just a record of a loan. This was a powerful legal instrument that gave the lender a security interest in the property. The borrower holds the title, but the lender, the beneficiary of the trust, holds the real power. If the borrower defaults, the lender can foreclose. My father had inadvertently handed me a loaded weapon while telling me it was a safety shield. I took out my phone, my fingers flying as I took clear, precise photos of every single page. I sent them to the one person I knew I could trust implicitly, Mr. Hayes. He had been my grandfather's closest friend and business partner, a shrewd and honorable real estate developer who had treated me like a niece my entire life. He'd been the one to advise me on the initial budget for the house restoration. I typed a short message, Mr. Hayes. I need your advice. Urgently. He called back in less than 10 minutes. His voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of steel. Alice, where are you right now? He asked. In my office at the house, I replied, my voice quiet, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. Don't go anywhere, and don't sign anything, he instructed. His tone sharpened. Alice, this document. Your father didn't have you sign a simple loan agreement. You are the primary lien holder on this property. You essentially hold the mortgage. They cannot sell it, transfer it, or evict a tenant without your signature to release the lien, let alone the primary lien holder herself. The world tilted back into focus. The betrayal burned hotter, but now it was mixed with a cold, clear rage. My father hadn't been protecting me. He had been placating me. Using a legal document he likely didn't fully understand himself, thinking it was just enough paperwork to make my investment feel official. They've already transferred the deed to my sister, I said, the words tasting like ash. They can't do that legally. Mister? Hayes countered, his voice sharp with indignation. Not without satisfying the debt owed to you. What they've done is a form of title fraud. And by trying to evict you, they have violated the terms of the trust agreement. They are in default. I sank into my chair, the leather cool against my skin. What does that mean? It means, Mister, Hayes said, and I could almost hear the grim satisfaction in his voice, that the full amount of your investment, $300,000 plus 5 years of accrued interest at the market rate, is due for payment immediately. The next morning arrived with a pale, gray light. I had not slept. I sat in my office, the deed of trust laid out before me like a battle plan. I heard a car pull into the driveway, followed by the sound of loud, cheerful laughter. Lauren had arrived, a day early, ready to claim her prize. I met her at the door. She pushed past me without a hug, her expensive luggage scraping against the foyer floor I had so carefully restored. She spun around, a triumphant smile on her face, looking through me as if I were part of the furniture. Wow. Alice, you really did a nice job. It'll be perfect for me and the kids. She walked into the living room and immediately started pointing, her voice full of authority. This sofa will have to go, it's too drab, and I'll put my dining set over here by the windows. You have 48 hours. Right, I'd appreciate it if you could be quick about it. That sofa is mine, Lauren, I said, my voice dangerously even. I paid for it, as I did for the table, the chairs, and the light fixtures you seem to so admire. She laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Oh, don't be so dramatic. Mom and Dad said you could take your personal things. They didn't say you could strip the place bare. This is my home now. You need to accept that. Just as she finished her sentence, the doorbell rang again. It was Mr. Hayes, dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He was not alone. Standing beside him was the local county sheriff, a tall, imposing man, whose presence immediately sucked the arrogant confidence out of the room. "Lauren," I said calmly, "this is Mr. Hayes. He's my legal representative." Lauren's eyes narrowed. "Legal representative, what for? This is a family matter." "On the contrary, Mr." Hayes said, stepping inside, his presence filling the space with an undeniable gravity. "This is a contractual matter." He opened his briefcase and produced a notarized copy of the deed of trust, along with a formal letter. He handed them to Lauren, whose hands trembled as she took them. "As you can see, Mr." Hayes explained in a placid, businesslike tone, "your sister, Alice, is the primary lien holder on this property. Her investment of $300,000 was secured by this deed of trust. By attempting to fraudulently transfer the title and illegally evict the beneficiary, your parents have defaulted on their agreement." Lauren's face went white as she scanned the document, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you talking about? My parents own this house." "No, Mr." Hayes corrected gently. "They hold the title, but Alice holds the debt. And since they are in default, that entire debt is now due. We have filed a formal demand for payment of the principal plus interest, totaling just over $420,000. Your parents have 30 days to pay in full." Lauren stumbled back, speechless. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed our parents. "Mr." Hayes gestured for her to put it on speaker. My mother's cheerful voice filled the air. "Lauren, sweetie, are you there? How does it feel?" Mom Lauren shrieked into the phone, her voice cracking. "There are people here. A lawyer and a sheriff. They're saying Alice owns the house, that you owe her hundreds of thousands of dollars." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then my father's flustered voice came through. "What nonsense is this, Alice? You put her up to this after everything we've done for you." "Mr." Hayes took the phone from Lauren's trembling hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, my name is David Hayes. I am representing your daughter. Alice, the deed of trust you signed 5 years ago is a legally binding contract. You are in breach of that contract. A formal demand for payment has been delivered. You have 30 days to remit payment, or we will initiate foreclosure proceedings." He then hung up. Lauren stared at us, her mouth agape. The sheriff, who had been a silent, stoic observer until now, took a half step forward. He looked directly at my sister, not with malice, but with simple, irrefutable authority. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "until this civil matter is resolved, you have no legal standing to ask anyone to leave this property. In fact, given the circumstances, your continued presence here could be considered trespassing." That was the final blow. The word trespassing, used against her in the very house she'd come to claim, shattered her entitlement completely. She grabbed her suitcases, shot me a look of pure venomous hatred, and stormed out of the house, leaving the front door wide open behind her. I stood there, in the quiet aftermath, the house suddenly feeling entirely mine for the first time. The 30 days that followed were a siege. It was a storm of frantic phone calls, tearful voicemails, and long, rambling text messages filled with accusations. They begged, they threatened, they cajoled. My mother left messages oscillating between weeping pleas about family and shrill condemnations of my selfishness. My father tried a different tactic, sending texts that attempted to appeal to reason, explaining their flawed logic about helping the weaker child, as if that justified his deception. I didn't answer a single one. I forwarded everything to Mr. Hayes, who handled all communication with their hastily hired lawyer. My silence was my shield, and my only response. They couldn't get the money, their pride, their ruined credit from past financial troubles, and their simple lack of assets made it impossible. On the 31st day, true to his word, Mr. Hayes filed the paperwork to begin the foreclosure. The legal process was slow, but inevitable. The house went to a public auction on the courthouse steps a few months later. I was there, standing at the back of the small crowd, wearing sunglasses and a hat, an anonymous observer at the dismantling of my own past. I watched as the auctioneer's voice echoed in the crisp autumn air. I didn't bid. I had no desire to own the house anymore. It was a beautiful shell. But the home that I thought I was building had been an illusion all along. It was sold to a young doctor and his family, who seemed to love it instantly. I saw them smile as the gavel fell, and I felt a strange sense of peace. After the legal fees and my principal and interest were paid from the proceeds, there was almost nothing left for my parents. With the money that was rightfully mine, I moved. I left Charleston, a city that now held too many ghosts. I started my own architectural firm in a new city, hundreds of miles away. It was small at first, just me and a drafting table in a sunny apartment that overlooked a park. But it was mine. It was a foundation I could trust because I had laid it myself. My first project was a small community library, and I poured all my passion into it, finding joy again in the act of creation. I heard through Mr. Hayes, who still called to check in, that my parents and Lauren had to move into a small, cramped rental apartment on the far side of town. Their reputation in the tight-knit Charleston community was ruined. The public nature of the foreclosure had laid their deceit bare for all to see. Lauren had to take a job as a receptionist, a bitter pill for someone who felt so entitled to a life of ease. They had lost their home, their standing, and their daughter, all in one fell swoop. One evening, months later, as I was sketching a design for a new client, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was my mother. The message was short. "You destroyed this family." I looked at the words on the screen. For a moment, the old guilt tried to surface, the lifetime of conditioning to be the good, dutiful daughter who fixes everything. But then I looked around my new office, at the life I was building on my own terms, a life based on honesty and self-respect. They had destroyed the family long before I called Mr. Hayes. They destroyed it at that dinner table, with a piece of paper and a cruel, calculated decision. I hadn't been a daughter to them. I'd been a resource. And when they thought the resource was depleted, they had tried to discard it. I didn't reply. I didn't feel anger or sadness anymore. I just felt quiet. I blocked the number, set my phone down, and picked up my pencil. There were new foundations to build, and this time, I was building them for myself.